Alright, as promised, today I'll be covering the SCG Open that was played in Dallas the last weekend. Now, the site that I usually look at hasn't updated the list yet, so I'm gonna have to use the official site for this one. It is not a big deal, just means that I have to go between the tabs and I will not be able to actually see the total cost of the deck, but that's like the only difference. Anyway, let's go right into it. And as I said last week, the decks are either decks that were good last week, decks that are supposed to counter last week's, deck that will counter the counters to last week's, and then finally the decks that just works, such as the deck before you, that is the Sultai midrange. Now the deck before you hasn't really changed since last week, it is pretty much the same list. The only difference is the inclusion of 2 Assassin's Trophy in the main board and a third one in the sideboard. But apart from that, the deck is just as the week before. The Incubation Druid, I can't remember how many decks had this card in it, but it's a card you see one of in Sultai here and there, so it's not like a big surprise. It's not a twist. Anyway, let's go to the number 7 on the list, which is gonna be the Rakdos midrange. Now this one is kinda interesting. We have seen versions of this, we haven't just seen them in top 8. Now this deck, it's basically a slightly slower red deck wins. It has pretty much the things you would expect. Chain Whirlers, Phoenix, it has the Rix. Now if you don't know what Rix actually does, if you pay the spectate cost, you dump your hand and draw 3 cards. But the deck is, it's quite straightforward. It is a aggro deck with a bit more expensive creatures than you would find in like a red deck wins. A red deck wins usually try to win much earlier than a mid-range deck for obvious reasons. But there's nothing here that's like stands out. The most interesting card is probably the Dire Fleet Daredevil. If you don't know what he does pretty much the same that Hostage Taker does, except he does it to spells or, instances or sorceries in your opponent's graveyard. He exiles it, then you can cast it, blah 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 blah. The same thing, and if you cast it, the spell or instance become exiled. But, I don't know, this is probably the deck that surprised me the most for having such a high top finish, because looking at it, it doesn't seem, I don't know, it feels a bit too slow to really go so far. I did see it in action a few times, but I was always surprised how it actually managed to work. Obviously, it's really good against mono white before they get any kind of +1/+1, but yeah, I was really surprised about this deck. Anyway, let's move on to the next, which is gonna be a mono blue aggro. Now, it's kind of hard to talk about mono blue aggro. It's a very straightforward deck. What you want is a Curious Obsession on the creature and, keep hitting the opponent and keep drawing counter spells, and eventually you either win or lose. It's a very easy deck to play. It is very straightforward, and obviously you can actually, just draw land after land and actually just flood yourself, but yeah. I mean, there's not much to say about mono blue. If you have seen it played at any level, you pretty much know what to do with the deck. It's very straightforward. Obviously, the deck is very good, and with the number of counter spells, it is... I mean, if a mono blue aggro deck gets a good start, then you might as well tap out. It's very hard to come back from once he gets his Curse Obsession working. Now, obviously, without the Curious Obsession early in the game, the deck becomes a bit more difficult to play and actually kind of fun. But when you get that perfect Curious Obsession hand, it doesn't matter what the opponent does if you just draw everything in the right order. It's a deck where when everything works, you pretty much win the game. But unlike my burn deck, if that works, it also wins really easily. But mono blue obviously has a much better win percentage when the deck doesn't do as well. Meanwhile, my mono red burn deck, when it goes wrong, it goes really wrong, and you pretty much lost the game. Again, the deck is not bad, but it's very straightforward, and let's move on. And we're moving on to Atsiris Aggro. Now, this is basically mono white with small creatures. The parts that makes it blue is the single copy of Deputy of Detention in the main board and the single copy of Deputy of Detention in the sideboard. Now, obviously, hi Carl. Now, obviously, the card is really good, but apart from like the Deputy of Detention, it is your basic mono white. We have Legion's Landing, History, we have the normal derpy creature, the Vanguards, the Witness, the Sky Mage. Again, it's a really good aggro deck, and I mean, if you get a good start, you can actually, just like Mono Blue, just take over the game, especially when you get the City's Blessing early on. But apart from that, there's not much to say. We have seen this deck before. The only changes to the deck is the 2 copies of Deputy of Detention. Everything else is pretty much as you would expect. Oh yeah, it does have the disdainful stroke in the main board or in the sideboard to, and the negates to actually have a few better matchups. But if you play this in a best of one, the deck would be, well, I'm actually kind of curious how good this deck would be in best of one. I think this deck is obviously good in best of three, but in best of one, I'm not sure like it would be worth just getting the Deputy of Detention, even if you ran 2 of them. But this deck is obviously a bit more made for sideboard post game. Obviously, Negate is currently a huge card with a number of early things you actually have to counter. But overall, if you took this to MTG Arena and played it, the deck will be pretty much what you will be used to. Although I would just go and play mono white just to save yourself the wild cards. Anyway, let's move on, and this time we're moving on to the Nexus deck. Now, I'm not going to spend too much time with this. It's just like with a control deck. It's not interesting. We all know what it does. It plays Nexus of Fate. It doesn't really have it. Well, this version has a win condition in the form of Hydroid, and it does have a few Mystic to help out. But, if you've seen one of these decks plays, then you've seen them all. It is very straightforward, and, I don't think, let's not get into the Nexus of Fate rant right now. Let's just move on to next deck. Again, this deck is very straightforward, and, well, if you played it once, you know what it does. Let's move on to the second Azorius aggro. Now, just as with the first, this is pretty much the standard with a white list, but with the, with the Deputy of Detention as the main new blue creature in the deck. Now, obviously, in the sideboard, you do find Negate and a single copy of Spell Pierce, so there is a bit more counter spells in this version of the deck. But otherwise, again, as I said with the other version, if you wanted to play this on MTG Arena, just go mono white, save you the cards, and you would do fine. It's a fine deck. It's a fun deck, but there's not much to say about it. It's not a huge change since the last expansion, so there's nothing really to talk about here. It's an interesting deck. Anyway, let's move on to the second place, which is gonna be, sadly, Esper Control. Now, as I usually do, I'm not gonna waste too much time on a control deck. Again, we know what it does. This version doesn't have a win condition outside of Teferi, really. It is your standard control deck. Negate everything. If it gets on the board, remove it. Go 1 for 1. And obviously with Wrath now actually being printed, it's, well, I mean, what can I say? This is your standard control deck. Just remove everything or negate it. The most interesting part of this version of the control deck is the fact that it has the Bellhaunt in the sideboard. Obviously, Bellhaunt comes in versus super aggro, like versus red deck wins and stuff like that, because, if a red deck wins gets a good hand, he can quite easily burn you to the point where a Banefire can actually end the game. Therefore, having something like the Bellhaunt is always good. But other than that, this is pretty straightforward. I could take some time to talk about the Thief of Sanity. This is obviously really good in mirror matches. It's really good against pretty much everything in a format. If it gets going, it can quite easily take over the game completely. But yeah, the card is what it is, and let's move on. Again, if you want me to actually talk for a few minutes about control deck, then sure I can do that. But I mean, it's not really. There's nothing to solve. It's very straightforward. Just as the winner of the SCG Open, I really screwed that one up, was so close to being good. Anyway, the winner is of course the mono blue aggro. Again, I don't need to go too much into detail about the deck. It's the new list pretty much. The list now includes the new Salamander Drake, but everything else is pretty much the same. Obviously, Mono Blue is a good deck. Some people find it fun. I don't find it particularly fun because it's such a static deck. You really want to do the same thing every single turn or every single game, and I don't know. I couldn't sit and play Mono Blue for like an extended period of time because to me it just gets a bit boring. It doesn't have it's not flashy, it's very straightforward, but obviously it's really good. Now, one of the best thing about Mono Blue is the fact that it does counter the Nexus of Fate decks very well because it has so many counter spells and can get our hand so quickly. One of the things about the Nexus of Fate decks are that they are a bit slow. Like, if they can establish, sure, they're just gonna sit there and just do their things. But if you can go in early on them, you do stand a chance. Assuming you're not playing on Arena and they start to time you, then it becomes kind of painful. Now the sideboard, well, it's not too interesting, although this version, I do remember it did have the deep freeze that was kind of funny because at one point in one of the game I watched, he did deep freeze, I think it was not Aurelia, it was a Lyra Dawnbringer, and the deep freeze, the 0/4 wall actually turned out to be really good for the opponent, and it was a bit of a puzzle to get out of it, so it was kind of fun to watch. But other than that, this is pretty much your standard thing. Now, as long as Nexus of Fate is actually a thing, I guess Mono Blue is a good thing that it exists. Like, it keeps the Nexus of Fate decks from spinning out of control in Arena because it's such a good counter. Anyway, that was the SCG Dallas Open summarized, and I think I'm gonna have to cut it right here because my throat is acting up. It's itching like crazy. I think I'm about to get a cold. That is quite unfortunate. Now, one thing I was actually gonna talk about was Azcanta. We saw a lot of Azcanta in this tournament. It was everywhere. The commentator were talking about it as well. It's one of those cards that should never have been printed, but it's here, so I doubt it's gonna go anywhere. Luckily, in 8 months, we are gonna have the rotation, and we are finally gonna get rid of things like Azcanta, Adonte Vanguard, Teferi, if I remember correctly. Yeah, Teferi rotates as well. But yeah, I'm gonna have to leave that for a later video. Because right now my throat is trying to really kill me. It's itching like crazy. Anyway, I will catch you guys tomorrow, assuming I still have a throat by then. And yeah, enjoy your evenings, and I'll see you later. This is Project signing out.